The pain of betrayal is an intimate wound, one that doesn't just mark the soul but claws at the heart. You don't see it at first, don't recognize the bruising because the laughter and warmth of love obscure it. But once that warmth dissipates, once you're left with nothing but the coldness of the truth, that wound, the betrayal, festers beneath your skin like a ghost, silent but screaming inside. It began as a whisper, faint at first, like the lightest tremor in the ground beneath me. I didn't want to hear it. I refused to acknowledge the fragments of suspicion that entered my mind. She, with her soft brown eyes and laughter that always held a little too much delight, had become the center of my world. No one else mattered. Her name was Isabella, a woman of striking elegance. Tall, slender, her posture a mixture of grace and quiet command. Her black hair cascaded in waves, framing her face in the softest of curls. Her lips, so often curved in a smile, were the ones that held the power to crush me with a simple glance. Her eyes, dark as the night, were the window to her soul, or so I had once believed. But now, I wonder. I don't think I ever really knew her. I should have known, I think now. The signs were there, scattered in the corners of our life. The late nights she spent away, the distant look in her eyes when I would reach for her hand. I chose to believe she was simply tired, that the weight of life, the demands of our world, had caught up with her. But now, as I sit in the silence of the room we once shared, the pieces of the puzzle fall into place. One evening, I followed her. I didn't mean to. It wasn't planned. But my feet moved of their own accord, driven by something deeper, darker than logic. I stood outside the restaurant watching her from a distance, and there he was, Elliot. The man whose name I had never heard in our conversations, but whose presence now burned into my mind. They were seated together, their laughter too loud, their intimacy too visible. I felt the cold sweat on the back of my neck as I watched them. My heart, which had once beaten in harmony with hers, now hammered against my chest, a frantic rhythm of disbelief. How long? I asked myself. How long had this deception been brewing beneath the surface? I felt my body move, though my mind screamed at me to stop. I didn't know what I was doing, only that I had to see more, to understand this betrayal. The man, younger than me by a few years, with his easy charm and effortless confidence, reached for her hand, and she let him. She leaned in, whispering something to him that made her laugh, the kind of laugh I had once thought was mine alone to hear. It was in that moment that I realized what I had to do. That night, I couldn't sleep. The room felt too small, too confined. The bed, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt like a battlefield. Her scent lingered in the sheets, a reminder of everything I had lost. I watched her sleep, her face illuminated by the soft glow of moonlight. She looked peaceful, innocent even. But I knew the truth now. The woman I had built my world around was a stranger to me. I wanted to confront her, to tear down the walls of lies, but I knew better. This wasn't about confrontation. No, this was about justice, about making her feel the same cold emptiness I felt in that moment. Revenge, not just for my wounded pride, but for the years of devotion I had offered her, only to find it was squandered on deceit. The following days were a blur. I plotted in silence, not allowing my thoughts to show. I watched her carefully, noting every movement, every word. My actions were deliberate, precise. I waited until the moment was right, until I could use her own plans against her. The opportunity came when she decided to leave for a weekend getaway. She didn't ask if I wanted to come. The invitation had always been assumed before, but this time, it was different. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. I had already set my plan in motion. I followed her once again, this time with a purpose. She didn't see me in the corner of the hotel lobby, didn't notice the cold smile that crept across my face as I watched her greet Elliot. They didn't see me when I slipped into their suite while they were out, my hands trembling slightly as I made sure everything was in place. I wasn't cruel. No, I wasn't interested in leaving a mess. I wanted them to feel the weight of what they had done, to know that I had been there. Let her see it. Let her feel it, I thought as I left, my footsteps silent, but my heart thundering in my chest. When she returned to the room, everything was as she left it, except for the note. It wasn't a harsh one, not at all. It was simple, calm, but it carried the weight of everything she had taken from me. I hope he's worth it. It was a line she would remember forever, I knew, because in that moment, I had taken something from her, just as she had taken something from me. Trust. The days that followed the note were a quiet storm. Isabella didn't confront me immediately. She didn't even mention it for what felt like an eternity. It was as though she wanted to avoid the truth, as if denying it would make the betrayal disappear. But I could see it in her eyes, the flickers of guilt, the way she hesitated when I walked into a room, the sudden silence that followed my every move. It was as if she were waiting for me to speak, to give her the chance to explain herself. But I wasn't ready to hear explanations. What could she possibly say? I had seen everything. I had felt everything. No amount of words could erase the weight of her deceit, nor could they heal the scar that had been carved into my chest. I watched her as she moved through our life together, the woman I had once loved, now a stranger who clung to the fragments of what we had. But there was no going back, not now. The silence between us had become unbearable, and still, she remained silent, as though she feared the moment I would speak, the moment I would demand the truth. It was on a crisp evening, one of those rare, still nights when the air feels thick with unspoken words, that she finally broke. We were sitting at the dinner table, the cold white light from the chandelier above casting harsh shadows on our faces. I watched her hands, which trembled slightly as she folded the napkin over her lap. She couldn't meet my eyes, and I felt the coldness of that distance creep through me. The silence stretched longer than it should have. Finally, she exhaled sharply, a breath heavy with something raw, something desperate. Her gaze flickered up to meet mine, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw something more than the indifference she had worn for weeks. She knew. She started, her voice weak, her throat constricting as though the words were too much to bear. I never meant to hurt you. I leaned forward slightly, my arms folded across my chest. I didn't speak, but my eyes bored into hers, willing her to say more. I wanted to hear her say it, to admit it. I wanted her to feel it, to know the gravity of what she had done. She hesitated again, licking her lips, before speaking in a voice so quiet I almost couldn't hear her. It was a mistake, she whispered. I never thought it would go this far. Not a mistake, a choice. The words were burning on the edge of my tongue, but I kept them inside. She would not have the satisfaction of seeing me break. Not now. Not when I had already broken her. And Elliot? I asked, my voice steady, though there was an edge to it that sliced through the air between us. Her eyes darted to the side, avoiding my gaze. A flush crept up her neck, but she remained silent, unwilling or unable to answer. The truth hung in the space between us, thick and suffocating. And then, with a soft, almost imperceptible nod, she admitted the one thing I needed to hear. I loved him, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of it. There it was, the confession I had been waiting for. But instead of feeling triumphant, there was something hollow inside of me. Was this it? Was this all that was left. A woman who had betrayed me in the most intimate way. A woman who had shattered every promise, every dream we had ever shared. I didn't speak for a long time. I couldn't. My mind was racing, but the thoughts were all jagged and splintered, each one fighting for dominance. Was this revenge enough? The note, the quiet justice of watching her suffer the truth. It had all been necessary, but was it sufficient? Could any act, no matter how calculated, truly fill the void that had been left? She was crying now, the tears streaking down her cheeks as she looked at me with the kind of vulnerability I had never seen before. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. "Please," she begged, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, don't leave me." I looked at her, my heart beating harder in my chest. I could feel the pulse of rage, of hurt, still pumping through my veins, but there was something more now. Indifference. It was the feeling I had never wanted to reach. The place where love and anger no longer had a grip on me, where only silence remained. I stood up from the table, the chair scraping against the floor, and I moved toward the door. Her eyes followed me, but I didn't look back. Not this time. There was no need for more words, no need to explain how she had destroyed me. The look on her face, the rawness of her regret, the fragility of her tears, told me everything, and that was my answer. "I'll be gone by morning," I said, my voice colder than I had intended. I paused at the door, my hand on the handle. "Take your time with your regrets, Isabella, but don't think I'll ever forget." I walked out of the room, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness, and I never looked back. Not once. The days that followed my departure were both suffocating and liberating, like a bitter wind that cuts through the bones while simultaneously clearing away the weight of a long-held burden. There was no relief in the immediate aftermath, no moment of clarity to tell me I had done the right thing. I moved through the motions of life, work, the mundane routines, the distractions, but nothing seemed to ease the rawness that clung to my skin. Each moment was filled with fragments of memories that now felt like someone else's life. The quiet mornings when I'd kiss her forehead, the soft sound of her laughter that used to fill our home, the way she would run her fingers through my hair as if it were a sacred ritual. They were all ghosts now, echoes of a time that had died with her betrayal. But the part that still gnawed at me, the part that burned when I tried to forget it, was the one thing I hadn't expected: her absence. I had walked away with my heart hardened, yes, but in the months that followed, the emptiness grew heavier. The silence was deafening. Was this the price of revenge? The answer haunted me. I had wanted to break her, to make her feel what I had felt in those moments of discovery, to leave her shattered in the wake of her own guilt. But what I hadn't accounted for was how deeply this would stain me, too. It was one evening, several months later, that the past knocked on my door again. I had been sitting in the quiet of my apartment, nursing a drink, my mind tangled in memories of her. How could it not be? The woman I had once loved was now an unreachable shadow, a ghost whose presence still lingered in the quiet corners of my life. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. It was sharp, insistent. I opened it cautiously, expecting perhaps a delivery or a misdirected guest, but it was her. Isabella stood in the doorway, her figure framed by the dim light of the hallway. Her face was pale, drawn with exhaustion, and her eyes were rimmed with red, as if she hadn't slept in days. The sight of her sent a shiver down my spine, though I quickly tamped it down. She wasn't here for forgiveness. I had made sure of that. She looked at me, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. I felt the weight of that silence, heavier than any words she could offer. She took a step forward, her breath catching in her throat as she spoke in a voice so thin it barely reached me. I need to talk to you. I didn't invite her in. I didn't offer her any comfort. Instead, I leaned against the doorframe, studying her face as though it were a foreign landscape. There was something different in her eyes, something raw, like a wound that hadn't healed, and I could feel my pulse quicken in response. I didn't think I'd ever see you again, I said, the words falling out cold and calculated, as though I had long practiced them in the solitude of my mind. She flinched at the distance in my voice, but she didn't retreat. I know, and I wouldn't blame you if you never wanted to see me. She stopped, swallowing hard. I didn't want it to end this way. I never wanted to hurt you. The words she spoke were so familiar, so hollow, that they felt like an old song I could no longer bear to listen to. How many times had I heard those words, empty promises of change, of regret, only to be burned again? I crossed my arms over my chest, keeping the distance between us. You've said that before, I remarked, my voice icy. The apologies, I didn't mean to hurt you. They don't mean anything anymore. Her hands trembled as she reached for something in her bag, a small, crumpled envelope. She handed it to me, her fingers brushing mine briefly. The contact sent a jolt. Through me, one I quickly suppressed. I opened the envelope slowly, my eyes scanning the contents. It was a letter, written in her unmistakable script, the ink slightly smudged in places as though it had been hurriedly written. It read, I know. I can never undo what I've done. I will live with the consequences of my actions every single day for the rest of my life. But what I've come to realize in the depths of this misery I've created is that I have nothing left. No one. Not even myself. The man I left you for, Elliot. He's gone, and I have no one else to blame but myself. I've been running from my mistakes, thinking I could outrun the consequences, but I can't. I've lost you. I've lost everything. I read it in silence, the paper crinkling slightly in my hands. So, Elliot was gone. He had left her, just as I had. A small, hollow part of me felt something. Not satisfaction, not joy, but something that felt too close to pity for comfort. I handed the letter back to her without a word. Her eyes locked onto mine, her face pale and fragile. She looked as though she had aged years in the time since I had last seen her. Her hair, once so carefully styled, was now tangled and unkempt, and her clothes, once pristine, seemed like a mere afterthought. The weeks that followed Isabella's visit felt like a slow descent into a quiet madness. I had thought that closing the door on her would be the final act of my revenge, that it would signal the end of a chapter that had destroyed me. But instead, it lingered, like the taste of something bitter that refuses to leave the tongue. I found myself constantly replaying our last encounter, her broken words echoing in my mind, taunting me with their fragile sincerity. And yet, no matter how many times I relived that moment, no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I had done the right thing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. It wasn't enough. I had taken back my power, yes, but in the silence that followed, I had realized something else. The emptiness had grown deeper, a void that nothing could fill. I had been so consumed by the need for revenge, the need to make her feel the weight of her betrayal, that I had overlooked the truth that was slowly gnawing at my core. I was just as broken as she was, and in trying to break her, I had shattered a part of myself. One evening, after a long day of fighting through the fog in my mind, I found myself standing in front of the small, nondescript cafe where she and I had shared so many moments. It was a place that had once felt like a sanctuary, a place where the world outside didn't matter. But now, as I looked at the door, I felt nothing but cold indifference. I could still remember the way her eyes had sparkled over coffee, how her laugh had always been just a little too loud, as though she wanted to be heard in a world that had long silenced her. "You're not here anymore," I thought. And that's the problem, isn't it? As I walked past the cafe, my gaze caught something that made my heart seize. A man, tall and confident, his hand resting possessively on a woman's shoulder. A woman, who looked strikingly familiar. Her hair was different, shorter, darker, but I could see the curve of her neck, the tilt of her head. It was Isabella. She was laughing, her eyes bright with the kind of joy I hadn't seen in months, and beside her stood the man she had left me for, Elliot. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sight of them together, so casual, so effortless, struck a chord deep inside of me. There, in front of me, was the very image of everything I had lost. The betrayal, the emptiness, all of it came rushing back in a flood that threatened to drown me. The anger that had been simmering for so long boiled to the surface. But it wasn't the rage of the man I had once been. No, it was something far darker, far more dangerous. It was the kind of anger that doesn't seek justice, but destruction. I turned on my heel and walked in the opposite direction, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts too dark to articulate. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, each one carrying me further into a place where revenge wasn't about making her feel the pain I had. It was about taking from her the very thing she had stolen from me, my peace. And I would make sure she never found it again. Days passed, and I couldn't escape the memory of that moment. The image of Isabella with Elliot, laughing and living her life without a trace of remorse, gnawed at me. But it wasn't just the betrayal that haunted me. It was the realization that she had moved on. She had somehow found the courage to rebuild, to move forward, while I was left clinging to the wreckage of what we once had. I couldn't let her have that. Not without paying for what she had done to me. The thought consumed me, and in my mind, it took root. I would make sure she knew what it felt like to lose everything, to lose the very thing she had so carelessly tossed aside. But this time, I would be clever, calculated. I would take from her, not just her heart, but her entire world, slowly, methodically. And so, I set my plan into motion. It started with small, seemingly insignificant actions, the kind of things that could easily be dismissed. An anonymous note left in her mailbox, reminding her of her past mistakes. A brief phone call, just enough to make her question whether someone knew what she had done, but not enough to give her any clues. I knew the game now. I understood the way guilt worked, how it could worm its way under someone's skin, how it could eat away at them without them even realizing it. I watched her from the shadows, observing her life as it unraveled in slow motion. I saw her reach for the phone at odd hours, her eyes constantly scanning the room as if waiting for something, someone, to make her face her own demons. I saw the way she flinched at the smallest noise, the way her hands would tremble when she thought no one was watching. It was working. The pleasure I once derived from seeing her suffer, from knowing she was in pain, began to fade, replaced by something far more satisfying, the power I now held over her. I knew her every weakness, every fear. The days bled into one another, and the weight of my decisions hung like an anchor around my neck. I had thought that by stepping back from the brink, I could finally silence the gnawing ache in my chest, but the truth was, I had merely replaced one kind of torment with another. I had walked away from revenge, but in doing so, I had allowed an even more insidious kind of guilt to take root. The kind that comes not from action, but from inaction. Isabella had been part of my life for so long that even after everything, the lies, the betrayal, the searing hurt, I couldn't entirely excise her from my thoughts. It was as if she had left an indelible mark on my soul, one that refused to fade. Every shadow in my apartment, every flicker of light at the corner of my eye, every gust of wind that rattled the windows seemed to whisper her name. Isabella. I thought about the power I had once held over her. I had almost relished it, the control, the slow unraveling of her composure as I drew closer to the edges of her sanity. But the closer I had come to truly breaking her, the more I realized that I had only been tearing away at myself. I had been looking for something. For closure, perhaps, or maybe, as the days stretched on, I had hoped to find some trace of redemption in the destruction I had caused. But what I had found instead was emptiness. It wasn't until I saw her again, unexpectedly, that the final realization hit me like a fist to the chest. I had been walking down the street, my mind lost in the haze of my thoughts, when I spotted her across the road. She was standing at the corner, waiting for the light to change. She looked different, more composed than when I had last seen her. Her clothes, once so ill-fitting in her sorrow, were now sharp, elegant. Her hair, now styled neatly, framed her face like a carefully arranged mask. She didn't look like the woman who had betrayed me, who had turned our world upside down with a single act. She looked whole. For a moment, I hesitated. My body tensed, every instinct telling me to turn around, to walk away before she saw me. But something held me there. I couldn't look away. I was drawn to her, like a moth to a flame, compelled to watch, compelled to know what had become of the woman who had once been the center of my universe. The light changed, and she stepped off the curb, her eyes scanning the street as she moved with an air of confidence. But when she passed me, her eyes, those eyes that had once been so full of warmth and affection, darted to mine for the briefest of moments. Just a flicker, a flash of recognition. It was enough to send a surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. My heart thundered in my chest. I couldn't tell whether it was anger or something else entirely. Regret, longing, sorrow, that surged within me. But before I could make sense of any of it, she was gone, swept away by the crowd. Just another stranger in the world, leaving me behind. I stood there for a long while, frozen in place. I could still feel the heat of her gaze on me like a burn. And as the crowd moved around me, my feet heavy and unsteady, I realized that everything I had tried to avoid had finally caught up with me. I couldn't move on, not without confronting this, not without confronting her. For all my attempts to erase her from my life, for all the moments I had convinced myself I had won, I couldn't ignore the truth that had been clawing at me from within. Revenge had never been about her. It had been about me, my inability to let go, my need to regain control, my fear of being forgotten. I needed to see her again. It wasn't about forgiving her or even getting some kind of closure. It wasn't about anything so simple. No, this was about facing the woman who had caused me so much pain and confronting the man I had become in the process. I found her the next day, sitting alone at a small bistro. She hadn't seen me yet, and I debated whether to walk away, to let the moment pass. But instead, I walked toward her, my steps slow, deliberate. When I reached the table, I didn't hesitate. "Isabella," I said, my voice low but steady. Her eyes widened in surprise, then immediately flickered with something else. Recognition. Perhaps. She didn't stand, didn't move. She simply looked at me, the same uncertainty and wariness in her eyes that had been there when I had walked away all those months ago. "I wasn't sure you'd ever want to see me again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what to say to that. I had spent so long holding on to my anger, my bitterness, thinking that if I could only make her feel the way I had felt, then I would finally be free of the weight that had held me captive. But now, standing before her, all that anger seemed hollow. It felt like a ghost, a thing that once consumed me but now only echoed in the corners of my mind. I sat down without asking. The space between us felt electric, charged with all the things unsaid. Time passed, but the sting of Isabella's betrayal never truly dissipated. It lay beneath the surface of everything we did, a subtle but constant reminder that no matter how much we tried to rebuild, something irreversible had shattered between us. I had thought that perhaps the rawness would fade over time, that the scars would become invisible, but every glance, every touch, felt like a lingering echo of the past. But that wasn't what hurt the most. No. What cut the deepest was that I had tried to trust her again. I had allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could pick up the pieces of the life we had once shared, the life I thought I would never have to let go of. But I had been wrong. It started small, almost imperceptible at first. The way she would check her phone a little too quickly when I entered the room. The slight shift in her demeanor when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I convinced myself I was imagining things, that it was nothing more than the paranoia of a man whose trust had already been shattered once. But deep down, the seeds of doubt began to take root, and no matter how much I tried to suppress them, they grew stronger with each passing day. I couldn't ignore it any longer. One evening, I returned home earlier than expected, my footsteps light on the hardwood floors as I entered the living room. The lights were dim, the television muted, and Isabella was sitting on the couch, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. I should have just greeted her, should have let the weight of the day fall away in the comfort of her presence. But I didn't. Something felt off, like a sharp edge under my skin, pressing and prodding, demanding attention. She didn't hear me at first. But then, just as I moved into the doorway of the living room, I saw it. A brief, sudden flash of her phone screen. Her eyes darted to it, and for a split second she froze. She didn't expect me to be home. My heart sank. Why? I wasn't sure what I expected, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had been down this road before, and I had vowed to never be the fool again. My body moved before my mind could catch up, stepping forward and breaking the silence that had settled like a fog between us. "You've been hiding something," I said, my voice rough. I didn't recognize the man speaking. This wasn't the calm, composed version of myself that had walked away from her years ago. No, this was something else entirely. Something darker. The man who had been wronged. She turned toward me slowly, her face a mask of feigned innocence. Her lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came out. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the tightening of her jaw. She knew exactly what I was talking about. I felt the bile rise in my throat, but I forced it back. "What's going on, Isabella? What's happening with you? With us?" Her eyes flickered to the phone in her hands, and just that small action, the glance, the guilt that I saw behind it, told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't just being careless. She was hiding something. Someone. Her shoulders slumped, a deep sigh escaping her lips. I never meant for it to happen," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how it all got so tangled up." I wasn't sure I could breathe anymore. The room felt smaller, suffocating. "So, what is it? Who is it this time?" She bit her lip, the tension in her frame betraying her struggle to find the right words. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it, as if weighing the cost of the truth against the price of her silence. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with regret. "It's someone I met a few months ago. I didn't mean for it to happen. It was just supposed to be casual. But I don't know anymore." Her words were like acid, burning, a hole through the fragile facade I had spent so long trying to rebuild. The room spun around me, the air thick with the weight of her confession. I had thought I was prepared for this. I had thought that I had steeled myself against the possibility of her betraying me again. But the truth was, nothing had prepared me for this moment. I took a step back, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Casual? After everything? After what you put me through before? You're telling me this is casual? Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't want to see them. I didn't want to hear the excuses anymore. They meant nothing. It wasn't like that, she whispered. I swear, I thought I could handle it. I thought I could stop before it went too far. But I couldn't. I don't know what happened. Stop, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Just stop. She flinched at the anger in my tone, but I didn't care. I didn't care anymore. I had given you everything, I thought. I gave you the benefit of the doubt. I gave you another chance. And this is what you've done with it? The cold, biting air hit me like a slap when I stepped into the night. The streetlights buzzed above, casting a sickly yellow glow on the pavement. My hands were shaking, but it wasn't just from the chill. It was from something deeper, a simmering rage that had been building ever since I first realized what Isabella had done. Again. I had believed, foolishly perhaps, that the second chance I had given her meant something, that the rawness of our past would make her hesitate before plunging the knife into the same wound. But no. She had done it again. The betrayal, the lies. She'd carved a new scar on a body that had only just begun to heal. And now, I was left with nothing but ashes. I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick, as I walked aimlessly through the streets. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I needed to move, to keep my body in motion, to outrun the suffocating weight of my thoughts. She had done it again, and I had no one to blame but myself. I had let her back in. I had believed in the lies she spun, the apologies that now felt like poison on my tongue. I passed bars, shops, and alleyways, but nothing registered. It was all a blur. My mind kept racing, flashes of her smile, her touch, the warmth she had once shown me, the affection she had promised. And then, just as quickly, the cruelty, the way she had gone behind my back, sought solace in someone else's arms, and broken what little trust had been left between us. She didn't even try to hide it this time. Her guilt was barely even a flicker on her face when I confronted her. It was as if she had already made her peace with it, as if she had grown used to the idea of betraying me, of testing the limits, of what I would endure. How could she have looked me in the eye so many times and still done this? You don't deserve her, and you never did, my mind whispered, cruel and unrelenting. I stumbled through the streets, my thoughts crashing together, like waves in a storm. I couldn't go back to that apartment. I couldn't go back to the life we had once shared. It's over, I told myself. The words seemed final, but I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in my gut. She doesn't get to win. Not again. I had come so close to letting her destroy me, to thinking that perhaps we could build something from the wreckage. But I had been wrong. What she had taken from me, my trust, my dignity, my belief in us, was not something I could simply give back to her. She didn't deserve it. She didn't deserve me. But I deserve revenge. The thought clung to me like a shadow. My mind, once clouded with confusion, now burned with clarity. I will make her feel the way she made me feel. The idea took root, slow and steady, like a vine twisting through my thoughts, weaving its way deeper into my heart. I knew what I needed to do. It wouldn't be violent or immediate. No. It would be far more intricate, far more deliberate. I had watched her over the past few days, careful, calculating. I had seen how she flinched when she thought I wasn't paying attention, how she would glance nervously at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. It was a simple thing, but it was enough. She was already unraveling. She knew what she had done, and now I would make sure she would never forget it. I would show her what it meant to betray me. I would make her feel the depths of her own guilt, drag it out of her until it consumed her the way it had consumed me. And when she finally came to me, pleading for my forgiveness, begging me to understand, I would stand there, stone-faced, and I would let her drown in the silence. Because that was the most painful thing of all, wasn't it? The silence. The absence of the man she had once known. The absence of the love she had taken for granted. I wouldn't lift a finger to hurt her physically. That would be too easy. No, my revenge would be quieter, subtler, more devastating. I would erase myself from her world, piece by piece, until the image of me that remained in her mind was no longer a person she could turn to for solace. She would regret what she had done, not because I would hurt her, but because I would be gone. And in my absence, she would see the emptiness she had created. The plan solidified in my mind, perfect in its simplicity. I had already begun. I knew where she would be tonight, the quiet, dimly lit restaurant where she and her new lover had met several times before. I had followed her once just to see, just to know. She wouldn't expect me there, but I would be, watching, waiting. The door swung open and I stepped inside, my footsteps soft against the wooden floors. She sat at the corner table, her back to the door, laughing quietly, her fingers wrapped around a glass of wine. Her lover, whoever he was speaking to her in a low voice, his words too muffled to make out. But I didn't need to hear the details. I didn't need to know anything more than what I already knew. She was happy with him. The hours dragged on, stretching into an agonizing stillness as I sat at the bar, my gaze locked on Isabella from across the room. The faint clink of glasses and hushed murmurs of other patrons seemed distant, irrelevant. All I could focus on was her laughing, her lips curling in a way that used to be reserved for me, but now she shared that smile with him. A stranger. A man who, unlike me, was ignorant of the storm that was about to break. I could feel it inside me. The dark anticipation, the cold, calculated plan taking shape like the tightening grip of a vice around my chest. She didn't know I was here. She didn't know I was watching her, absorbing every detail, every nuance of her movements, every flicker of her eyes. The way she leaned forward, eager to hear whatever he was whispering, the gentle tilt of her head that told me she was lost in him. My stomach churned, not from jealousy, but from the overwhelming sense of control I was beginning to savor. She took everything from me, and now I would take it all from her. And then, in an instant, she glanced up. Her eyes met mine. A brief flash of recognition flickered across her face, and for a second I could have sworn I saw something. Guilt? Regret? Fear? But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a thin veneer of composure. She turned back to her lover, her hand still resting on his, but the subtle shift in her posture, the tightening of her shoulders, it told me everything I needed to know. She knew what I had seen. She knew that I had watched her, and for the first time, I saw the weight of her choices crushing down on her. I smiled to myself, but there was no warmth in it. There was no joy. Just a cold, calculated satisfaction. She was mine again, in this moment. She was mine to break. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate, controlled. The door opened just as I reached it, the bell chiming faintly in the background. The waiter glanced up, giving me a quick nod, but I didn't return his look. My eyes were focused solely on Isabella, who had stiffened at the sound of my footsteps. I felt the tension ripple through the room, as though the air itself had become thicker, denser, charged with unspoken words. I walked toward her, my steps measured, each one purposeful. She was looking down now, her fingers tapping nervously against the edge of her glass. Her lover didn't notice me approach at first, too absorbed in his conversation with her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a confident air about him. The kind of man she always seemed to fall for, easygoing, charming, someone who didn't look too deep beneath the surface. I wasn't here for him, though. I didn't care about him, but I could already tell he was just as much a fool as I had been. I stopped at their table, standing just to her side. I let the silence stretch between us, the weight of my presence, pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. For a moment, I simply observed, letting her feel the full weight of the situation, the realization that I had found her here, in this place, with him. Finally, she looked up, her eyes wide, a rush of emotion flooding through her, panic, guilt, disbelief. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The man beside her finally turned, his eyes narrowing as he took in my presence, his expression one of mild confusion. He looked between Isabella and me, trying to piece together what was happening, but I had no intention of explaining. I wasn't here for an audience. "Isabella," I said, my voice low and steady, slicing through the quiet. My name on her lips now felt so foreign, so hollow. She flinched at the sound of her name, her body tense, her fingers tightening around, the wine glass in front of her, as if it could somehow protect her from the weight of the moment. "Hello, love," I said again, this time emphasizing the word, the mockery dripping from it. The man beside her looked between us, clearly sensing the tension, but not yet understanding its depth. "Who is this?" he asked, his tone polite but curious. I didn't even spare him a glance. "It doesn't matter," I replied dismissively, my eyes never leaving Isabella. "You don't need to worry about me. Worry about your choices." Her face reddened, her lips trembling slightly. She opened her mouth as if to say something, to explain, but no words came. Instead, she simply looked down at the table, her chest rising and falling as she tried to regain composure. "Go ahead," I urged her, my tone venomous now. Tell him everything." Her gaze flickered to me, her eyes filled with unshed tears. But the anger in my heart was too strong, too loud for me to feel any pity. She deserves this. She deserves to face the truth of what she's done. She took a shaky breath and stood, up, her chair scraping against the floor. I could see her hand trembling as she reached for her purse. She opened it, and for the first time in a long while, I saw her vulnerable, exposed, raw. I stood on the sidewalk, my breath forming clouds in the cold night air, my hands buried deep in the pockets of my coat. My heart, still a fractured mess, slowly began to beat with a new rhythm, a steady pulse of resolve. She wasn't going to get the satisfaction of seeing me crumble, not again. I had given her so many chances before, so many second opportunities to make things right. She had taken every single one of them and crushed them underfoot without a second thought. But now, I wasn't the man I had been when I first met her. No. I was someone new. Someone who had learned the hard way that love wasn't a currency to be spent recklessly, that trust wasn't something you could throw away and expect to come back to you unscathed. I looked back at the restaurant one last time. I knew she was sitting there, trying to piece together what had just happened. The silence I had left in my wake would follow her, much like the sting of her own guilt. She would feel it with every passing moment, and it would gnaw at her until it became unbearable. I had already seen the cracks in her facade, the way her shoulders had slumped, the way she had tried to hold herself together but faltered in front of him, in front of me. It's over, I thought. But not for her. Not yet. The next few days passed in a blur of calculated moves. I avoided her calls, her texts, the messages that were more desperate each time. I didn't need to hear the regret in her voice. I didn't need to see her pretending to be the woman I had once known. What she had done was irreparable. Every apology she offered would fall on deaf ears. I had no interest in rehashing the past, in walking through the same broken paths again. But I knew one thing. She couldn't just walk away from this without facing the consequences. And I wasn't going to make it easy for her. So I began to tighten the noose of my revenge. Slowly. Methodically. I had a plan now. She hadn't. Just betrayed me in the traditional sense. No, she had humiliated me, made me a fool in front of people I considered friends. She had let me believe that what we had was real, and then shattered it into 1,000 pieces, leaving me to pick up the wreckage. But this time, the betrayal wasn't just personal. This time, it was public. I started with the social circles she frequented, the places where she felt safest. It was subtle at first, a conversation here, a whispered word there. I didn't have to do much. She had built her life around a network of people who knew nothing of the lies she had been living. But once I started, I couldn't stop. Slowly, like poison seeping through the cracks, I planted the seeds of doubt. I told her closest friends how she had spoken to me, how she had justified her infidelity with empty words, and I saw the way. Their expressions changed when they looked at her. It wasn't obvious at first, but the doubt crept into their conversations. I watched her squirm when they asked her, not directly, but with a quiet curiosity in their voices. I overheard one of them confront her, their words sharp and pointed, asking her why she had lied to all of them. I knew she had tried to spin the truth, to fabricate a version of events where she was the victim, but no amount of spinning could undo the reality of what she had done. And soon, the distance between her and her friends grew too wide to bridge. Then came her family. Her parents, the people who had always supported us, who had always believed in the strength of our bond. It wasn't hard to make them see the cracks. I simply had to remind them of the times I had opened my heart to them, of the love I had shown them. I didn't have to say much. The stories told themselves. The guilt in her eyes, the shame she wore as a veil, spread like wildfire. And soon, it wasn't just her lover who would feel the heat. It was everyone in her life. She couldn't hide anymore. Not from the people who had once adored her, not from the ones who had watched her falter and fall. The weight of her own betrayal crushed her. It had to. It was days later when she came to me. The look in her eyes was no longer defiant. It was broken, shattered. She stood before me, her figure small, a shadow of the confident woman who had once stood tall in front of me, demanding nothing but loyalty from me while she gave nothing in return. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. The guilt was written all over her face. She had expected me to meet her with rage, with anger, but I simply stood there, cold and composed. I let her tremble before me. Let the silence grow heavy between us, thick with the tension of unspoken words. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but I heard the tremor in it. I made a mistake. I should have never done it. I should have never let you go. Her words felt empty, hollow, and as much as I wanted to feel the satisfaction of hearing her beg for my forgiveness, I couldn't bring myself to care. The days that followed were a strange blur of cold satisfaction and an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. Perhaps regret, perhaps a distant feeling of emptiness. I had orchestrated my revenge carefully, expertly, but now that it was done, there was an unsettling silence. The truth was, the more I let it settle into my bones, the more I realized that the bitterness of vengeance wasn't sweet. It was hollow, like a glass emptied of wine, its echoes reverberating long after the glass was gone. I hadn't seen Isabella since that night. She hadn't contacted me, and I hadn't gone looking for her either. There was a strange peace in that distance, a peace I hadn't expected. I expected more fury, more anger. Instead, I felt nothing. Or perhaps not nothing, but something so much more complicated. One evening, a week after the night at the restaurant, I found myself walking the familiar streets where we had once laughed, shared moments of warmth, where I had held her close, thinking nothing would ever change. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the pavement, and I couldn't help but remember how often we had walked these streets together. Now it felt like I was walking through someone else's memories. I passed a small cafe we had frequented. The smell of fresh coffee and pastries lingered in the air, but it didn't pull me in the way it used to. Everything about this town, this life we had shared, seemed like it belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. Then, as I turned the corner, I saw her. Isabella. She stood near the entrance to a bookstore, her back to me, her posture stiff, as though she was trying to make herself invisible in the midst of a crowd. But I knew her too well. Even without seeing her face, I could tell it was her. The way she carried herself, fragile, broken, as if the weight of what she had done had finally crushed her. She hadn't seen me yet, and I could have turned away, could have walked past and ignored her. I had every right to. But there was something about that moment, something in the air, a feeling that drew me in like a magnet. I hesitated. Do I approach her? Or do I leave her to the consequences of her actions? I stood there, caught in a quiet internal battle. The stillness between us, the unspoken history, seemed to stretch endlessly, suffocating everything in its path. Then, as if sensing the tension, Isabella turned, her eyes immediately finding mine, and for the briefest of moments, I saw her, really saw her, as she once was. Her face softened, her eyes filled with an ache I hadn't seen before. It was a strange thing to look at her and recognize the raw humanity in her gaze, even though she had been nothing but a stranger to me for so long. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. There were no words left to say, not after everything. She only stared at me, as if waiting for something from me, something she could never have again. I felt a tightening in my chest, but it wasn't the familiar sharp sting of anger. It wasn't the cold satisfaction of revenge either. It was a deeper, older ache, one I hadn't acknowledged in so long. Is this what forgiveness looks like? But no, this wasn't forgiveness. This was recognition. Recognition that I had once loved her, recognition of what we had lost, recognition of the truth that we were two people standing on opposite sides of a canyon we had dug ourselves. She took a tentative step forward, her eyes searching mine as if looking for some sign that I was still the person she had once known. But there was nothing left between us but the remnants of what she had shattered. I never meant to hurt. You, she said finally, her voice fragile, the words barely a whisper. I looked at her, her face pale, the lines of regret etched deep into her features. It was almost painful to see her like this, but I pushed the impulse aside. This wasn't about sympathy, it was about clarity. You did, I said, my voice steady, though the weight of the truth pressed down on me like a heavy stone. And that's what you'll have to live with. She looked as though I had struck her, her breath hitching in her chest. I could see the hurt in her eyes, the desire to explain, to plead for understanding, but I wasn't the person who could offer her that anymore. She had taken that from me long ago. I stepped back, my gaze steady, unwavering. There's nothing left to say, Isabella. What's done is done, and now you'll face it alone. She stood there, frozen, as I turned and walked away from her once again. Each step I took felt lighter, freer. I had not only reclaimed my dignity in that moment, but I had also let go of the last remnants of the man I had been when I loved. her. But just before I turned the corner, I hesitated once more, the faintest doubt flickering in my mind. For a brief moment, I thought I heard her voice, soft, almost inaudible, calling my name. But I didn't look back. The cold breeze bit at my skin as I walked down the familiar streets, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness of the night. The city felt quieter now, more distant, as though everything had become muted in the wake of what had transpired. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the cusp of something I couldn't name, but something important all the same. Revenge, in its purest form, had been executed. But there was still a lingering sensation in the pit of my stomach, a sense of unrest. I hadn't expected the encounter with Isabella to leave such a mark on me. I had thought that when it was done, when I had finally severed the ties, it would be a clean break. But there was no clean break. There was only the raw, jagged edge of history that refused to be forgotten. The streets stretched ahead of me, empty and cold, like the silence that had settled between us. My hands were shoved deep into my pockets, the wind biting at my face, but I didn't feel it. My mind was still tangled with what had just happened, with the way her eyes had held mine for that fleeting moment, wide, vulnerable, full of pain. I had expected that pain to bring me satisfaction, to feel like a victory, but instead, it left me hollow. Is this what revenge really is? I wondered. The slow unraveling of yourself as much as the other person? The question lingered, twisting, in my gut, like a knife. And it wasn't until I found myself standing at the edge of the park, the trees shivering in the wind, that I realized how far I had wandered from where I should have been. I had been searching for answers, seeking closure that I hadn't quite found, even in the finality of our encounter. I sat down on the bench under the large oak tree, the cold of the metal seeping through my clothes. But I barely noticed. My eyes closed, and I let myself lean back against the sturdy trunk, the weight of the world seeming to press down on me in that quiet moment. Everything I had done, every word I had said, every step I had taken to exact my revenge. Was it enough? Had I truly reclaimed what I'd lost? Or was I simply another version of the person I had been with her? I could still hear her voice echoing in my head, that fragile plea, the tremble of her regret. She hadn't meant to hurt me. She hadn't meant to betray me. She hadn't meant for any of it to happen, but it had. And no amount of apologies could change the fact that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. She broke me, I thought, as I clenched my hands into fists, and I let her. But in that moment, sitting beneath the towering oak, something inside me shifted. The anger that had burned so brightly, the drive for revenge that had propelled me forward, began to ebb away, leaving something else in its place. Something softer, something quieter. It was as if I was standing at the edge of an ocean, watching the waves of my emotions crash against the shore, only to recede, leaving the sands smoother, less jagged. I opened my eyes, staring out across the park. The wind had picked up again, rustling the leaves in the trees, the sound like whispers from another time. I thought of the things I had done, how I had made her feel the weight of her own lies, how I had exposed her to the very people she had once leaned on for comfort. I thought of the way she had stood before me, crushed under the weight of her betrayal, and I felt a flicker of something unexpected. Is this really the end? The thought echoed in my mind, and I knew it wasn't. No, it wasn't the end of the story, just another chapter. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. I groggily reached for it, my fingers brushing against the cold screen, and saw her name flash across the display. Isabella. I hadn't heard from her since our last meeting. I considered ignoring the message. I had no desire to engage with her again, no reason to revisit the pain. But curiosity, that same curiosity that had led me down this path of vengeance in the first place, won out. I opened the message. I know I don't deserve a response, and I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know that I've left him. I left everything behind. It wasn't worth it. It never was. I'm so sorry. I'll never make the same mistake again. I read the words, each one a fragile thread of remorse, each one tying her guilt to me in ways I couldn't undo. I could feel the weight of her regret, the rawness of her confession. But as I read the message again, a strange sense of detachment washed over me. The anger was gone, replaced by something quieter, more resolute. I had already made my peace with the truth of who she was. She had already paid the price for what she had done, and I had paid my own price too. In every whispered conversation, in every small moment where I had to walk away from what I had once believed, I had been broken. I hadn't expected this, hadn't thought for a moment that this pattern would repeat. But there she was, Isabella, standing in front of me once more, and I was left to face the undeniable truth. Her betrayal, the one I thought was behind us, was now taking shape again. My body tensed, heart racing, a sharp, cold clarity creeping through my veins. I had seen this movie before, and the ending hadn't changed. This wasn't a memory or a haunting from the past. No, this was happening. Again. I was living it once more, my every instinct screaming at me to flee, to escape, to forget. But something in me knew that there was no running from the truth anymore. The quiet moments I had allowed myself to savor, those fragile hours of peace after the storm, had been false. They had been an illusion. She had lied to me again, the same way she had the first time. Only now there was no sweet apology waiting for me, no trembling confession in the middle of the night. There was only her, standing there, her eyes averted, as if she couldn't bear to meet mine. As if she were ashamed, but not ashamed enough to keep her hands clean. She was still wearing that same red dress, the one she had worn when I first discovered the truth, the one she wore when she thought she could pull me back into the web of her lies. I should have known, should have seen the signs, but I had allowed myself to trust her again, allowed myself to believe in the hollow promises of reconciliation and second chances. She began, but her voice faltered. She took a step forward, her shoes clicking on the tile floor, and I could feel my pulse quicken with each movement she made toward me. It wasn't just her that I could hear in the silence. It was the sound of every lie she had ever whispered. To me, every excuse she had crafted to justify the unthinkable. My throat tightened, but I didn't speak. I couldn't. Words at this point would be pointless. They wouldn't change anything. She could say whatever she wanted, and it wouldn't matter. I never meant for this to happen, she continued, her voice barely audible, but the pleading in it was unmistakable. I was weak. It's not what you think. Please. I interrupted her with a sharp shake of my head. Don't. Don't do that. Don't try to convince me again. The words hit her like a slap, her shoulder slumping in defeat. She seemed so fragile, like glass about to shatter, but it didn't move me. There was nothing left for me to feel. I had given her everything. I had put myself through the pain of trusting her, of believing that the past was just that, the past. But I was wrong. I was a fool. I crossed my arms over my chest, feeling a tightness in my chest that was hard to ignore. My emotions were a storm, swirling within me, but they were tangled with a sense of finality, as though I was seeing the whole picture for the first time. There was no ambiguity left in my mind. She had chosen someone else, chosen to deceive me again. And now she had no more room in my heart. You promised, I said, my voice steady, though the anger simmered beneath it. You promised me that this wouldn't happen again, that you were different, that we were different. She stepped back, the guilt evident in her face, the weight of my words sinking into her skin like a slow poison. She knew. She knew what this meant. But it wasn't just the betrayal that stung. It was the realization that I had allowed her to do this to me again. She had broken me once more, and I had given her the chance. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I was confused, lost. I thought it was over, but he still—" "Stop!" I cut her off, the word sharper than I intended. I stepped closer, my eyes never leaving hers. "I can't keep doing this, Isabella. You don't get to come back and pretend like nothing happened. You don't get to break me over and expect me to pick up the pieces." She seemed to shrink in on herself, her hands fidgeting nervously in front of her. I could see the tears in her eyes, but they didn't move me. I had cried all the tears I could for her a long time ago. "Please," she begged, her voice barely, more than a whisper now. "I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know why I—" "Stop making excuses," I said again, my voice cold, though there was a part of me that wanted to reach out and comfort her, to hold her close as I had once done, but that part of me felt distant, almost foreign. "I don't want your apologies. I don't want your reasons. I want you to leave." Her breath caught in her throat. "Leave?" She seemed stunned, the word hanging between us like a poison. "You want me to leave?" "I want you to leave," I repeated, my voice firm, unyielding. There was no hesitation now, no second guessing. It was over. I was done. She stood there for a long moment, as if she didn't believe me, as if she thought I might relent, might soften. But I didn't. I couldn't.